Hey guys, this is Calm, and I'm going to do the 6th round of the FIDE World Rapid. We're following Mamedyarov. He is rated 2753, and in this game he is white against Ildar Kierulan, 2658. I believe the time control is 15 minutes, plus some amount of seconds per move. I forget, as it's a while since I did the first round, but the point is it's fast, and we're trying to pick up what we can from Mamedyarov's win in this tournament. So he plays d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, d5. Okay, so here I have been playing bishop g5 with the idea of, after say bishop e7, just taking on f6 and taking on d5. It's a very simple line. It gives white play. Later on the queen side, you just have like moves like queen c2, e3, knight f3, bishop d3 kind of set up after you castle. You have this rook over here, which you can potentially move to the b file, or you can just move this h rook, which will be on the f square. The f1 square to either be b1 or c1, and basically you just go for a b pawn push, and you look to undermine this kind of bc pawn setup of blacks. And it just leads to a nagging edge for white, which I kind of like. So, okay, so bishop f4 was played instead. This is the other option. I don't know anything about this really, though. Just there's a lot of theory associated with it, as there is in the other line. But the other line is, I think, far more understandable because it's very simple. So that's why personally I've gone for that line, but this is just as good. So it takes on c4. Yeah, I mean you can play e4 here if you want. I would imagine, based on Mamedyarov's style, that he's more likely to play e3 and just look to pick up this pawn without taking any risks in the center. Generally, I really liked his white play because he plays very solid, and basically he just doesn't give much away. He just goes for these small edges, which is what I'm kind of trying to do with my white play. See if he plays e4 here, then I'm completely wrong, and I think he's changed his style a lot recently. Okay, so he does play e3. Bishop d6, this is interesting. So I'd imagine we don't particularly want to trade, because if we do that, black can take back with, taking back with the queen is fine. You could also take back with a pawn potentially. Then that pretty much forces bishop takes c4, because then otherwise black will play d5, and he'll probably play d5 next move anyway, in that scenario. And then you just have a very strong lock in the center, it'll be very even. I'd be tempted to play bishop g5 here, but maybe that's just, based on my preference of playing bishop g5 earlier. I don't particularly think it's a waste of a move, having moved here and then to g5, because generally in the bishop g5 line, black plays this bishop to e7, or occasionally b4, but normally e7. And part of the idea of that is just to stop this long pin. So if we can move this again, but we're enacting the pin, and this bishop's not particularly looking at anything, then I think that could be good. Other options may be something like knight e2 or h3. Knight e2 or knight h3, I mean. Because then if the capture on f4 happens, we can recapture with our knight, which at least puts our knight in a better position, even though we've traded off those pair of bishops. But anything is fine, pretty much. I just wouldn't allow the capture whereby we have to recapture the pawn, because that leaves this isolated, and it leaves these f-pawns doubled. And I think that would be a little bit better for black. Okay, so bishop g5 is played, h6, bishop h4, and now c5. So we can take here, and then after the recaptures with the bishop, we can then trade queens here. With check, obviously king takes his force, then we could even long castle with check again. Probably then king e7, and actually black's king is in a relatively safe place. Also allows them to develop this rook to d8 pretty quickly. It's just a kind of way to simplify the endgame. And given that if we play d takes c and get that line, where the king ends up on e7, we can then capture on c4, but because the pawn structure will be symmetrical in that we'll have 4 here from e3 to h2 against this e6 to h6, and we'll have a and b against a and b, and both these c pawns will be gone, our d pawn will be gone. Just the pawn structure is so similar, and the material count is even. There's no imbalances at all in terms of like 2 bishops against 1 or anything like that. I just feel like it's going to be an endgame whereby it's going to be very hard to make an edge. So I probably would be tempted to pass on that offer, although if white wants to draw, he can go for that line and be very confident in it. So suddenly it's not worse for him, it's just, I think only 8 moves in, we should be looking for more as white, and as such, I'd be trying to keep an imbalance somehow. I mean, I just develop with like knight f3, because then if the capture on d4 happens, we can recapture with, the knight or the queen, and although the pawn structure is similar, we're just developing quickly, and we're not trading off, our queens, so there's a lot more play left in the position. This knight f3 was played, captures. Okay, so queen takes is interesting. Knight takes is interesting. You can also play pawn takes, of course. It's just my particular style of play. I like playing against isolated pawns, I don't like playing with them. Although you can make more of a case for it in this position, because by having this pawn on d4, we're going to restrict the push of e5, whereas this could happen if we recapture in any other way. And by pushing e5, black would then be able to develop this bishop onto, say, e6 or f5. We have to be careful about taking here quickly, and then allowing e5, because if we can't immediately recapture on c4, then by playing bishop e6, he may have the potential to hang on to this pawn. Although I don't think it's too much of a concern at the moment, given that if we take on d4, or if we do it with the queen, we have 2 pieces, both the queen and the bishop attacking c4, and if we take with the knight after e5, we'll be able to play knight b5 with a double attack on this bishop, which would then give us time to take on c4 as well. So, given that, I would stick with my personal preference of not taking an isolated pawn, and recapturing with either the queen or the knight. And I would go with the knight, I think, because if we capture with the queen, just knight c6 pushing it away. I mean, yes, we can capture on c4 with the queen, or just drop the queen back to, say, d2, allowing rook d1 later to double up on the d-file. But I think knight takes makes most sense for me, because having this knight on d4 kind of restricts his knight development, like his most logical knight development, c6. So then we could trade, after the capture on c4, he'd be left with an isolated a and c pawn, whereas we just have, 2 pawn islands, as opposed to what would be 1, 2, 3. So that gives us an advantage if we ever get to an endgame. And a small edge is something I'd like that. So we'll see. Yep, knight takes d4. And just castles was played. Bishop takes c4, very logical. And bishop e7 goes back, okay. So that's interesting, because I think that's kind of an admission that black didn't gain anything by playing bishop d6 and forcing white to play the extra move of bishop g5. Because now he's just going to try and get out of that pin and make sure that white can't, double or triple up on the d-file, which could have been awkward against black's queen. So I'd say white has a very small edge here, because his pieces are developed, and both his bishops, in particular, are in good positions. Whereas this bishop is kind of blocked by his own pawns, and this bishop is passive. This knight on d4 is far better than this one on b8, just in terms of how far into the board it is. Black's only real advantage is he's castled, whereas white hasn't, but probably do that next move. You may feel like black can develop this bishop via b6 and bishop b7, but then we have a move like queen f3, and that would actually, I think, straight up just win this rook, so black can't really do that. So immediately I just expect castles, I think. Yep. Okay, bishop d7. The idea here is to allow knight c6, and then the trade there. Queen e2 is played. Knight c6. Rook fd1. I like this move because white has two open files, c and d files. So you may think there's no difference between rook ad1 and this, but there is, because if we play this rook to the d file, then we can't play our other rook to the c file because it would be blocked by this rook, and that means that we're not going to be able to take advantage of both of our open files, whereas this move does the same purpose and it keeps our options open. I mean, we can still have the potential of just, doubling on the d file, but if it turns out that we want a rook on the c file, we can still do it with our undeveloped rook and keep this in a good position, as opposed to before where we'd have to move this rook back, which essentially just delays us if we then want our f rook on the d file. Knight e5, bishop e3, knight g6, so just retreat that, bishop g3, queen e5, bishop c2, okay. So at the moment this bishop isn't doing much, although I said it was nicely placed. It's blockaded by this kind of structure of pawns, and by moving it to c2 in the future, we can put pressure on this knight on g6, because obviously if we could, we'd trade this knight for this bishop, because it would weaken the e6 pawn, and it would make it isolated and double the g pawns. So I guess that's white's plan. Yep, bishop c2, and now queen h5 is played. So I personally would be very tempted to just trade these queens, and then, take on g6, and play with this pawn advantage. Although actually if we take here and the knight recaptures, we also have other options to consider, because if we then move this knight, say to f5 for example, attacking this bishop, then if black takes this, he's doubling his pawns on the f file, and we also can play rook takes d7, which would bring our rook into his 7th rank, which is very annoying. We pick back up our piece, and our pawn structure's better. We're attacking b7, also threatening to take on g6 and then take on e7, which would be a hanging piece. This is probably what I'd go for, queen takes queen and then knight f5. Okay, so that was played. So probably black is to play like bishop c6 to not allow that to happen, because it seems too strong. Bishop c6 is played. And now white just decides to trade off this bishop on e7. So what that is going to give is, it's going to give white the two bishops, which is kind of a small advantage. And it's also done with tempo, basically, because when we take here it's with check. And then after knight captures, we can play something like bishop d6. What that's going to allow us to do is firstly pin this knight to this rook, so it kind of forces rook d8. And then in the future we're going to be able to play something like bishop a3 or whatever, just get it out of the way, and not allow black to capture this bishop, so we're going to retain that 2 bishop edge for a long time. So let's play, let's play, let's played. Rook d8, and e4, okay. So e4 is good, because if you look at the position of this knight, it can improve its position by going to d5 or f5. By playing e4 we block off both those squares. And it also gives us the future potential of playing e5 and just really solidifying this piece on d6, or potentially in the future a knight on d6 via knight e4 to d6, which could be very strong. It's not a move I'd have immediately considered. I think I'd have just played rook d2 with the idea of rook ad1, just doubling on that d file immediately. But probably e4 is better. Another reason I wouldn't have considered it straight away is because it blocks this bishop, but actually this bishop isn't doing much now that this knight is moved. So I think this is something where I can learn. Like, I don't see how or why to arrange the pawn, advances in my mind in this kind of stage. I understand that very well in the opening, and obviously the importance in the endgame. But right now, that isn't the move that would have, made the most sense to me. But the more I think about it, after he's played it, and the limitation of squares that it's doing, particularly this d5 square, because both his knight and his bishop can, support it, it seems good. So we'll just see how the game progresses. Knight f6 makes sense, bring his knight more back into play. Just f3 supporting, makes more sense. Now knight c8, so you can see how passive black is getting. With this knight, just trying to dislodge this bishop. So you could play d6 here, but actually this, again, allows this d5 square opening, so I'd expect just a bishop move here. Probably bishop a3, or bishop g3 or something. Okay, bishop f4, same kind of thing. And now a4, after the knight moves. This is just limitation of space. We're trying to push a5 and give this knight less squares. And the less squares black has, the easier it's going to be for white to maneuver his pieces into better positions. So we're also thinking about b4 and b5 to push away this bishop, along with a5. And then we'll just have really advanced pawns, which potentially we'll be able to do a lot of damage with. Okay, e5, trying to regain some space. That's probably a good move. Bishop comes back to c1, that's interesting. So what it says by moving back to c1 is that he doesn't want knight c4 to come after bishop e3, because obviously that would attack the bishop and force it back to c1 anyway, as to protect the b2 pawn. So that's why he's doing that. Rook d8 is played, and just the trades. Okay, so the trades are fine for white because there's no entrance squares for black. Probably he's going to look to move his king into the centre to help support that, and then redevelop his pieces. I think e5 was a good move from black, which white wasn't really counting on, and it may have been that this a4 was a bit premature, because by giving up the d file for white, black has improved his position relative to before. He's also traded off the pair of rooks and gained control of this d file, so I'd say the game is back to pretty much even now. You can say long term maybe white has more potential due to the double bishops again, but again black has this d file, so I think it's pretty much even. King f2, a6. Guess he didn't want to play a5 as to allow this b5 square for white's knight. Bishop b3 is played, stops knight c4. Knight back to a8. The idea here is just to reroute it, probably via e6 to d4. White shouldn't allow it to come to d4 because this would be too strong. Bishop b3, knight c7, rook c1, knight e6. Again, so knight e6 immediately, even though I just talked about this. I don't like it immediately because as white here, I just take it. Double isolated pawns here. Seems very good endgame for white to me. I mean, I guess black thinks that's the best situation for him, where he trades white's bishop pair off and gets worse pawns, and he thinks he can just hold it, but it's a bit strange to me. Like, he could have played king f8, king e7, and then knight e6, and it just seems completely fine. I don't see why he'd be in a rush to do anything else. Okay, so knight e6. White does take. Okay. And then b3 just supporting this pawn, frees up his knight for movement. Now king f7, knight b2, rook d3, knight b4. Good as if takes on b3 can take on c6. And after these recaptures it'd be even material. But again, white's just got this better pawn structure on the king side. So it takes b3. Captures, check. King goes back to f1. Okay. And then to e2. Okay, so here he didn't want to play king g3 immediately because of knight h5 check and then knight f4. So that's kind of good because I'd have just played king g3 automatically. But here he shows that he understands like the difference, and by going back here first for one check, he's now able to block the checks with bishop d2. And then he can use that bishop to help support the a5 push, and then capture this pawn on a6, and this a4 pawn would then win him the game, I think. So that's probably his plan. Okay, so black plays a5 as to not allow white to push a5, instantly winning. But I think we can just check and then go rook a7 and then takes. Should be pretty much the same situation. Yeah. He's just moving his king up to support the pawn now, and we'll go pretty quickly because I don't think black's going to be able to hold this. Oh, okay. Forget that. Because he found a cute trick here, because after the rook takes pawn, the recaptures knight c5 check. He's going to pick up this rook again, so he's won the pawn back, essentially. It's just a question of whether his knight can escape from the bishop and king kind of trap after. So we'll see. King c2. Yeah, okay, so now after bishop e3, his knight has no escape squares at the top, none down the bottom because of our king. So after bishop e3 and king b2, he just wins material, so he's going to win. Bishop e3. Okay, and there's no more moves, so yeah. Just king b3 here is going to win the knight and win the game, so black resigns. So that was a nice win. Very simple play, I think. Points for my learning. I think the c4 push, the timing on that was interesting. This I kind of saw, so I was pretty happy with that. I just think this knight e6 was a mistake, personally. But it was, this king f1 was good as well. It's not something I'd have considered, because it seems backwards and you don't want to get your king traps, but he knew about the importance of this a pawn and the potential of that a few minutes before I did. So that's something I should be looking out for more in the future. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. This is round 6 of the Fido Rapid, and I'll see you guys next time.